Welcome to Old Path and our study through the Old Testament book of Proverbs. We are at chapter 16 this week, and we're going to kind of dive right into it and get started on it right away. I just want to let you know, for the end of the study, I've been doing some topical things, just kind of going through answers to common questions, or even what I think sometimes are even misconceptions. And one that we're going to deal with today, because we're just in the first week of a new presidency, and the question about, does God appoint people to office? Does man have any kind of a say in it? It's a big discussion that goes on. People love to argue about it. And, of course, there are all the conspiracy theories that go on around it. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time in that. I just want to take a look at what do we see mentioned in the Bible, and how do we see that actually play out? So I think that's a very important conversation to be had. If you have been following along, and we're going to be making a decision very, very soon about the trip to Israel and potential dates for when we're leaving. We had one planned for March, but people are still a bit hesitant. And there is some options that we have, but I need to hear from people if they're interested in going. I need to hear from them pretty much right away. And so anyhow, if you haven't already reached out, the people who have, I'm in contact with them through email. But if you're new and you haven't had a chance to contact me about it, but you'd like some information about a trip either in March or some other time in the spring or sometime later this year in the fall, contact me through oldpaththeology.net, and I'd love to go over what the options are with you. So Proverbs 16. We're going to just deal with this a little bit longer of a chapter, but some observations about this actual chapter itself, helpful as far as I'm concerned for what we read here. It's kind of, some of it's a bit of a reset. First of all, chapter 16 is probably a bit more heavily weighted on the direct relationship between God and man and what man's responsibility before him is. And so the interaction that you'll see proposed here and the outcomes of it are much more focused on the person that's walking rightly before him. And you'll notice that there's a lot more mention of that God's direct involvement with mankind. And so that's kind of with that in the background, and then what are the outcomes of those kind of things. Of course, we don't get away from the typical Proverbs. There is this outcome and that outcome based upon whether or not a person is righteous or wicked or whatever else. But the idea that God has a direct input on people's views and what it is that they think that they should do and how they ought to operate. This is even more so. Now, again, it's implied throughout. Of course, when it comes to the idea of what is right and wrong, what is good and evil, all that kind of stuff, whatever man devises, that doesn't matter. It's not him who decides what is good or evil, right or wrong. God's the one who decides that. And so man may be oblivious to it, that's fine, but that doesn't mean that he's any less accountable, and that it is ultimately God who decides whether or not something is good or evil, or any of those other contrasting things. So this is, of course, implies all of that, and I hope I do this often enough in this particular book. I want to make sure we are really, really careful to remember that this has universal application. And of course, this is a king writing to his people, the subject. But sometimes we lose sight of the whole thing, that this is a man writing to other men and younger men, people that he would want to give instruction to. And again, once we get past that, we can say, okay, great. Does that mean that it has application to all people? And you would say yes, but in particular, these would be people that would be conscious of who God is and whether or not he is moving among his people and doing the things that he's doing in the world, all those kind of things. If you're to say that you don't even believe in that he exists, it really is seen a whole lot different. Then this just becomes kind of philosophical, although it is kind of a study of human nature. But if this is going to be understood by its original intent, it has to assume that the person that's reading it believes that God exists and how he interacts with his existence, or with his creation rather, and that the existence of it is going to help us to understand how this all works and why would Solomon be led to the place where he makes these observations. So it's a little bit of a longer chapter, so let's kind of dig right into it. Again, really profound as far as I'm concerned, and really helpful if we're able to understand why he would be saying these things, first and foremost to young men, and why it's important that they would heed his counsel. So let's have a word of prayer and we'll jump right into the text. Father, we thank you so much for the time that we can spend in your word and how you will reveal to us the things that we should see and how it is that we should walk. Understanding first and foremost the history and to whom it was said and why it matters. And then moving on to what does it mean to us today and how can we walk accordingly. So I pray, Father, that you would open our eyes and our understanding as we study your word and that you would be glorified in all that we do. And we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. So Chapter 16 begins this way. The preparations of the heart belong to man, but the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. Now, again, think about this. How would this sound to a person who is dedicated to the things of God? Like if, here as far as the church is concerned, how we would listen to this, as opposed to a person who doesn't even recognize the existence of God. So you would think it's no less true, but nonetheless, it also would assume why this would matter to a person, and if they don't believe in God, they're not going to really pay much attention to what's being said here. This is really intended for the person who does believe in God and original recipient, remember, my son or young men, however it may be that this is being read, but it's Solomon writing to younger men. And there are things that pertain to younger men that are super important. That's why he will talk about wives and things like that. So, of course, it becomes very specific to younger men considering marrying down the road, or maybe even in marriage, and how the things that they would want characteristically as far as a wife is concerned. When it's a young woman reading this, that falls flat. Now, again, that doesn't mean that you can't say, well, how about we just change gender on this? And if it doesn't have anything specific to the role or of a husband or a wife, you can just see it in kind of a universal kind of a way of principle, especially since the big picture is it's good to receive instruction that is godly instruction. So it's sometimes wisdom, knowledge, understanding, a whole litany of different words that he uses, but it's still intended to bring us to the same understanding, the same bottom line. If we're going to have some kind of input about what God would expect of us, what's the quality of that? And those are the kinds of things, if it's something that God has given to us, it's of great, great quality. And if it's something that is specific to a particular gender, you could say, well, how would that work if I was a girl and you speak into guys? You get the picture, and you could see that here. So the same thing in this case right here, the preparation of the heart belongs to man. So the preparation of the heart, when it's of godly matters, it's guy or girl doesn't much matter here. So the preparation just means simply the planning or the preparation of the heart, not just of the intellect, but what makes us do the things that we do, what motivates us, what makes us who we are. So then here's the second part of it, but the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. Now that assumes, of course, that the thing being spoken of is godly because he's given input. Now, it's intended to just, in the big picture, to say, well, we can plan everything that we want to, but what we end up ultimately doing or saying along those lines, it's really ultimately God who interacts and gives to us his desire. So we might have our plans, but when God speaks and we know what he wants us to do, then what we do going forward is always going to be something that he orders, even though we have our plans. Doesn't always mean that it's completely different. Sometimes God may say, I completely approve of the plan. And that means that he's interacting. And that's what you're going to find is much more in this particular chapter than any that we've covered thus far, is that idea that God is directly involved in the process of actions and words and deeds, all those kind of things. So in verse 2, we get this. Now all the ways of a man are pure in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the spirits. Now, this is basically the same thing that a person can figure out anything that they may want to do, think that they've got it all figured out, and yet nonetheless, that's because they only see part of the picture. And if we're willing to hear what God has to say on things, he may decide to completely step in and correct everything. But right here is what it says. All the ways of man are pure in his own eyes. Like, I'm going to do this, and I know that's exactly what God wants to do. And of course, he would approve of it because it's such a, in my mind, a godly thing. And yet here it says, but the Lord weighs the spirits. It's the way of saying, but he's looked at all the motivations behind what a person is coming to in their own mind that they're going to I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that. And then God says, well, what are your motivations for that? Ultimately, he's the one who knows all such things. Commit your works to the Lord, and your thoughts will be established. And this is very similar to what we see in chapter 3, verses 5 and 6, about trust in the Lord and lean not to your own understanding, acknowledge all your ways to him, and he'll direct your paths. It's very similar in its construction and certainly its thought. The idea of committing your works, though, this is a little bit of a difference because this is once things have already happened. And this commit is, we would think commit is a different word than what's here. What you find often, this word is used in the way of rolling something that's too heavy to pick up and carry, like rolling a stone away. And that's really kind of the rolling of the stone over a cave or a tomb or whatever else. You can't pick it up and carry it. You have to roll it over and move it to someplace else because it can't be carried. It just needs to be moved or rolled out of the way. It makes the verse sound totally different. So if you're rolling away your works, the things that you have done, if you bring it over to him, then it says here, and your thoughts will be established. So whatever it is that you may be thinking about doing, whatever it is that you have going along with the plans of verse 2, whatever those things are, rolling them over and bringing them to him and saying, this is what my plans are, which of course he already knows. But the comfort in that is that your thoughts will be established, what you should do going forward when God has been given by you. Of course, he knows what it is, but there's the willingness to be able to acknowledge it. I'm rolling it over. I'm bringing it over to you, Lord. What would you have me to do? And then, of course, the interaction is that God gives direction, and then everything is established. It's done as he would have it done. The Lord has made all for himself. Yes, even the wicked for the day of doom. This is one of those passages that Calvinists love to point to, and that God creates even those that are doing evil as though he's the one who causes them to do the things that they do. This is an observation again of Solomon, that if God is ultimately the creator of all things, he's the creator of all things, even to the point when he judges all of humanity at the end of things, and which, in some of the other Proverbs, he speaks about those things, that there is an eternity in the way of a judgment that is ultimately to come. Though he doesn't speak about it in kind of the same ways that we see in the New Testament, because his knowledge would be a little bit different than ours, again, considering who he would be able to have read and what God would have said. And so he's not really thinking in the eschatological sense like we might in the 21st century or anything in the New Testament. But this idea that everything is created by God, even to the person and the things that they will do, even all of that will be, since he's the one who's created all things, everything in his creation will ultimately, even if it comes to the day of wickedness and evil being judged, he's the creator of all things. He didn't create the evil. He created mankind, who created the evil themselves, and he's the ultimate judge to those things. Now think about this too. If it is a situation like this, the person reading this would even be able to say, well, if that's the case, what do I do to avoid that? And so rather than it being written in a way that God has created just for the point of condemnation, he could say, God has created all these things, man has chosen evil, but there's a way out. So again, this is one of those things. If you really want to read something into it, you can. But looking elsewhere in the text, what Solomon would have known, of course, because he would have seen what was happening. He would know the story of them coming in at the Exodus. He would know that at the end of Joshua, when he said to the people that choose this day whom you will serve, or whether it was Moses that was also talking about you're going to serve the gods of the ones that are on the other side of the river, or you will serve the Lord your God, but you need to choose a side ultimately. So the idea that there was left to man the decision that they could make on eternal matters, that's consistent throughout both the Old and the New Testament. And it's verses like this one and some in the New Testament where you just kind of forget all that other stuff because you've got your opinion made up already. What they think this is saying is not at all what it's saying. The Lord has made all for himself. The creation was that he could have interaction with mankind, and even those who would rebel against them or against him, he has given this world and the life that is on it, and they will all come to him, the creator, at some day. There is judgment that is implied in this, the day of doom. Now, verse 5. Everyone proud in his heart is an abomination to the Lord. And the the idea of abomination, when God looks at these things, the things that man would produce, if you will, when you see that it's every proud in heart is an abomination, though he would join forces, none will go unpunished. So pride is the issue that's here, and God has a problem, of course, with the pride of man and the self-exaltation. To him, it's a detestable thing. It's an abomination. He despises it. So man may think very highly of himself, and it's that idea of thinking so highly of yourself, you think you have no need of something else. What God despises is that kind of a heart, because it will always be distant from him. And ultimately, he's going to have to be the one who will judge such hearts like that. And it says here, though they join forces, none will go unpunished. And so it's the joining forces, it's the joining of the hands. There are some that would think that though they will try to hold everything together by themselves, they're going to come to nothing. The joining forces and the joining of hands seems more like, even if they can win other people to their side of things, their outcome will not change. Whether it's just them or a multitude of people, none of it's going to change, because every proud heart it's detestable as far as God is concerned. And it's not that he hates the people, but the heart behind them is what ends up being judged. His desire is to see them saved, or to come to him. Now remember, this is again Solomon, a king of Israel, a man under the law, speaking to other young men, or other men younger than he is, and they are also people who should be governed by the law of God, the Torah. And so you can see why it would sound a little bit different than just the typical secular, or even the people who are not subject to the law, the people of the church, let's say. It's going to sound a little bit different to them, but still the underlying truth is every bit the same. Now, verse 6, in mercy and truth, and the truth is the certainty or the surety of what God has to say. In mercy and truth, atonement is provided for iniquity, and by the fear of the Lord, one departs from evil. This is mind-blowing when you read this, because how cool this is. And you can see it's already something that's been put in place. The idea of the atonement for sin, if you understand what the law has to say, the law would not only identify what sin is, but then it would tell you what the necessary offering would be for the atoning. And if we're talking about atonement, we're talking about sacrifices of blood, because it's the blood that atones for sin, which is Leviticus. So what Leviticus tells us, chapter 17, that without the shedding of blood, there is no remission for sin. And that's the important part of this, which Solomon would understand that. But it is God, because of his mercy and the assurance that we have, the certainty that we have in him, it is because of that we can say this atonement is provided for our iniquity. And by the fear of the Lord, one departs from evil. By that knowledge, a person is going to come to him, the one who can take care of the issue, because he's provided for our iniquity by atoning for it. And in this case, it was animals for them. For us, in the New Testament, it's to looking at the person of Jesus. And the better we know that, the more we will be repulsed by the evil things. We will not pursue after evil. We would pursue after that which is acceptable and right before God. So, and by the fee, it's by, or it's on account of, or it's because of, or it's the produce of the fear of the Lord, one will depart. Not wanting to be in the place of rebellion against God, wanting to be right before him instead. So God's given atonement. Man would choose that and say, I would desire that, not making myself an enemy, rather embracing that which God has offered to us. Just looking at verse 6, think about it to an Old Testament mentality. Think about it as far as we're concerned here in the church today. The idea that God, by his mercy that he has shown to us, and because of the certainty that we have in him, the assurance that's been given to us, we look to him as the one who has given us a permanent atonement. No longer bulls and goats, no longer the repetition of having to offer offerings, but once and for all, Jesus offered himself. So Hebrews 9 and 10. Verse 7, it says, when a man's ways please the Lord, he makes even his enemies to be at peace with him. An interesting thing, because there's a couple of different ways that this is looked at. The first part of it, when a man's ways please the Lord, that means that whoever the person may be, and again, if this is a king writing to younger men, especially if he's writing to sons in the literal sense, These would be princes. These would be nobles. These would be people of high stature. But again, if it's all written down and it's passed around, this could be to anybody who's a young man seeing this. But think about this. When a man's ways are pleasing to the Lord, that's just a very straightforward statement. When God examines the life of a man, though not perfect, but pleasing to him, if that's the case, then it says he makes even his enemies to be at peace with him. If this is a king writing this, he could say, they may not like me, but because God favors us, they are subject to us. That's how it was definitely with them. Now, it also may have the meaning, and we see this in the New Testament a little bit, that people, not necessarily that they're not going to be your best friends and like you and everything else, but they're going to live at peace with you because they really can't find fault. They may not agree with what you believe, but they're not going to see you as an evil person, and they're going to find themselves not in a place of conflict and turmoil with you. So then verse 8, better is a little with righteousness than vast revenues without justice. Pretty obvious. It's better to live in the integrity of righteousness before God, even if it doesn't mean it works out in any material sense, than to have all the material things and yet not have that title over you as being right or acceptable to God. Verse 9, man's heart plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. Now, there are a number of passages that are like this, but there's something I think, as I read this, I want to think a little bit beyond what's pretty much obvious here. The idea that acknowledge him in all your ways and he will direct your paths, again, chapter 3. But this one here, I think, goes a little bit further than that. A man's heart plans his way. So there's not the first time, even in this proverb, that we've seen this, and we've seen it a number of times in the other proverbs. But the idea that man has his plans. I know what I want to do. Here's what I desire to do. And we make our plans. We make our schedule, whatever it may be. We've got our design on things. However, it's the Lord who directs his steps. Now, that would mean that there are times when those two things may come in conflict. And we have to remember that God is so far beyond us in his understanding of things. When you read Isaiah 55, that's the place where he talks about my ways are not your ways. My ways are higher than your ways. You can go back and read that. In fact, let's take the time to do it. Let's just go over there. I'm not going to do a lot in the way of commentary on it. It's Isaiah chapter 55, and it starts at verse 6. So let's go there. And we'll just read it. This is God speaking, and so it doesn't really deserve or need a whole lot of our commentary. Verse 6 says this, now seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts. Let him return to the Lord, and he will have mercy on him, and to our God, for he will abundantly pardon. Now let's remember, this is the nation of Israel, and this is the recognition of when this is being written. There is certainly the outcome that is going to happen to the nation of Israel, what's left of it in Judah when the Babylonians come. It was during Isaiah's time that much of the north was being wiped out by the Assyrians. This is just a time of great turmoil, and this is what God is saying to them, even with all of that. And then notice what he says here. My thoughts, as he said in verse 8, they are not your thoughts, nor are my ways your ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Now, we're not Israel. The church is not Israel. Our relationship with the Lord is much different than theirs was. But there is still nonetheless the same truth that goes on here. The things that God does, we don't understand them. We're not equipped to understand it. We're not eternal. We are very temporal, and moment to moment things can change with us, but he is unchangeable. So that recognition that man can have everything figured out on his own and make his own plans, independent of what God may want to do, you're going to find yourself always in a place of conflict. Better for us to be able to say, I know what I want to do, but your ways are higher than my ways. Your understanding is well beyond mine, and your ways are not the same way that I would do things. So I may have my plans, but here's what I do. And this is like rolling it over to him. It's the same kind of a thing. I know what I have planned, but before I take a step, what would you have me to do? That recognition that I can't see everything that you can see. This is so incredibly practical and really good counsel. In verse 10, divination is on the lips of the king. His mouth must not transgress in judgment. Now, when we see the word divination, instantly we start thinking witchcraft, sorcery, all the rest of that. But witchcraft and sorcery was intended for divining or trying to understand what's the desired outcome. They wouldn't believe necessarily as far as God was concerned. They might think that they can consult their spirits and their gods, and by divination, sorcery, witchcraft, have communication with their gods. And that was always explained. Divination is a very negative thing. It's the same word that's used here that's used in the negative, but here it's used very much in the positive. But it assumes a lot here. In this sense, the king. Now notice what it says, divination is on the lips of the king. That is assuming that the king is hearing from the Lord, and it's the Lord who is divining, explaining to him what is and what is not acceptable. Sometimes he would do that through the prophets. Times it happened even in dreams. And so there was just ways that God would communicate to the king. And by this time, Solomon's already had those kinds of encounters, and God had given him direction. So even at the beginning of his whole thing, when God asked him, what would you have me to give to you? And he asked for wisdom, and I don't know how to lead your people. So if there is this idea of the king being in direct contact with the Lord, and the Lord really giving him divine counsel, whether again by however it may be, sometimes even by angels. Then there were times that it was through prophets that he had. It's a much different world that we live in now because we have God's word, which is it's just as good of a way in instructing us that God can use as any. But here in this case, this is very, very specific to that time. So, and divination, or rightly divining, understanding what it is that they're supposed to do, that is what's on the lips of the king, because God's the one who's uttered it. His mouth must not transgress in judgment. So he must not ever do something that's contrary to the counsel that God has given to him. Really important. We all remember that too. Honest weights and scales are the Lord's, and all the weights in the bag are his work. Now, this is an interesting take on what we read in chapter 11, when God says of man, unjust weights. Now, remember, weights were how they were able to say, how much value does something have? Well, if I brought something and it weighed a particular amount, that weight would have to be, if they said that it was X number of grams, well, then it better be a true read. It should be the exact same that you're saying, or you can defraud the person. So the idea there in chapter 11, verse 1, is that those unfair weights, you're saying it weighs this much when it actually weighs something less in your favor, that's an abomination. It's detestable. God hates it. Now notice this is him now in the place of possessing the weights. Not that it's going to be that there's even the potential for unfairness. It says here, honest weights and scales, those are the Lord's. So he's the one who has them, first of all. And again, man, same thing. If man is going to deal equitably with other people, God is honored in that. And then, but see, notice it says, and all the weights in the bag are his work. Now that can translate into the worldly part here, but that's just way of saying God has a standard. And if he was the one who was weighing things out, there would never be any inequity. It would always be correct. It would always be what it's supposed to be. And so really, really interesting. So whether it's that when God weighs things, that's always perfect because everything that he does is perfect. Or if he's speaking to the person, they are going to, as it were, use his weights in the way that they will mete out things or weigh out things. It's going to be right and honorable, as opposed to what we saw in chapter 11, verse 1, the ones that are not fair. They're an abomination. Verse 12, it is an abomination for kings to commit wickedness, for a throne is established by righteousness. Very, very simply understood. As far as a king is concerned, in his sense, as far as Solomon's concerned, that's a king, though it was not God's decision, and we're going to get to that after the study about this, but it was not God's desire for them to have a king. And their insistence on having one with Saul was something that Samuel needed to say, was something that it was a rejection of God to govern over them, and they were going to have to deal with the consequences of it. He told them of that in 1 Samuel 8. But all the way back to the time when Moses was hearing from God in the wilderness, God told him there's going to be a day you're going to ask for a king. and he's going to, this is what's going to happen because you won't allow me to govern you. Well, kind of the same kind of a situation here. Now that that's already been done, the idea that it's an abomination for kings to commit wickedness, kings especially in Israel, but it doesn't have to only be Israel, because these are the authorities and the people that are put over men, and if they do things that are unrighteous, then God holds them accountable just as he would, but more so the kings of Israel, because they're the people who are supposed to be representing him, and he is supposed to be involved in giving them direction, though it was not his original intent, not what he wanted, but he allowed them to have it. So it says, for a throne is established by righteousness. And again, this has first and foremost application to the nation of Israel and that king. But in the broader sense, this would be kings are the ultimate ruler of a particular nation. They're the ultimate authority of mankind in that particular kingdom, and they will all be accountable to him also. They'll have to stand before him. It says, righteous lips, verse 13, righteous lips are a delight to the kings, and they love him who speaks what is right. Pretty obvious that when a report is brought to him, again, he's going to appreciate the person who's being honest, and as opposed to the person who's being dishonest. These ones all, 14, 15, they all kind of relate to the same thing. As messengers of death is the king's wrath. So if you do something to stir up the king, the messengers, if you will get, they're going to be his wrath. It's just going to be, they're going to be, it's not necessarily the persons are the messengers, but if you've enraged him, you're going to know about his rage because it's going to come down on you. But a wise man will appease that wrath. And so by the things that they say, the things that they do, realizing that their actions could bring about his wrath, but they will not do it because wisdom would tell them, choose a different course. No sense in riling him up. Then verse 15, in the light of the king, this is by a different thing, not wrath, by a light of the king's face is life. So if he's in a great mood and everything is as it should be, and you're contributing to that, it's just a wonderful outcome. And his favor is like a cloud of latter rain. So if you're living in his favor, it's going to be like a field that just receives the rain from heaven, and it has its intended purpose, and there's growth and health and all of those things. Verse 16. How much better to get wisdom than gold, and to get understanding is to be chosen rather than silver. So this is the instruction, the righteous instruction, righteous direction, all of the things that we can get. And they're more valuable, as Solomon would put it here. They are to be desired even more so than riches, things of temporary wealth. So that's pretty common. We've seen plenty of those kinds of passages. Now, verse 18 and 19 kind of go together. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before the fall. And the haughtiness is the self-exaltation. It goes right along with pride. And it's better to be of a humble spirit with the lowly than to divide the spoil with the proud. So once again, it's if you're going to have to be, if he's equating poverty and riches, and the riches having a negative and the poverty having a positive, it would be better to put your lot in, if you will, with those that are impoverished, but they are a place of integrity, than those who are rich and may have come by it by other means. Which one would you want to be in with? But the first part of this, pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. There is something that Paul says a little bit about this in 1 Corinthians 10. So we're not going to go to it. It's the whole chapter. The first part of the chapter is Paul giving just a few examples of some of the things that happened in the history of Israel. And then he gets to the latter part of it around verse 10, where he starts to unravel all these things and pretty much just says, now all these things happened to them, their whole history. It's known to us for a few reasons. They're examples to us, and they are to be an admonition. Don't do as they did. And then he says, so anyone who thinks that you stand, take heed lest you fall. That's the idea of your own self-assurance and your pride, your haughtiness, your exaltation. When you start to look more at yourself rather than what God would do in preserving or directing or anything else, that's always going to have a bad outcome. And that's the first part of what we saw, verse 18 and 19 going together. But again, pride goes before destruction, before the things completely melt down and the mistakes come along and there's a recompense for all of one's actions. So pride will always be what leads to that outcome, destruction, and a haughty spirit before the fall. That self-assurance, I'm sure that I can do this. Again, take heed to yourself that you stand lest you fall. That's what Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 10. You can see the parallel to it. It's pretty cool. Verse 20, he who heeds the word wisely will find good, and whoever trusts in the Lord, happy is he. Let's look at the second part of that. The one that trusts in the Lord. This is the same thing. I have confidence in him, and I know that he will do as he says. So is there a happiness? Is there a contentment? Is there a peacefulness in the heart of the person who would be able to say, I trust in the Lord, I have confidence in him and in none other? That's going to have, again, a direct relation on us personally and how we are able to conduct our own lives. But the first part of this, he who heeds the word wisely will find good. Now, there's two different ways that this is looked at, depending on what translation you're looking at and even what manuscripts. So it's here it says word, as in the word, speaking like of the Torah or the word of God. Other translations might even favor the idea of a word that you might get by report. And so it's just something that has come to the knowledge of. So he who heeds the word, and that's just to do rightly by what has been communicated to you. Now, because of the second part of verse 20, it would give the appearance that this does reflect the word of God and the idea of obedience to it, or heeding what you've been told. And again, if it's wisdom and human counsel, but it's godly wisdom and human counsel, still taking heed to that is wise. It's going to have good outcome. So that person that does that wisely, they're going to find good, and whoever trusts in the Lord, happy is he. So the one thing that kind of helps us to break the tie in this, of trying to figure out which one's which, just remember what we have at the end of it is that the person who does what God instructs, there's a happiness in them. There's a contentment. They know that everything is right as it should be. So whether it's counsel or whether it's reading the word directly, same outcome, so it must be the same source. The counsel that you might receive, a word from someone, or the word that was spoken to you that somebody comes and communicates, if it's godly counsel and that communication, it's going to still have the same outcome as if we're going directly to the word, because God uses both means. Verse 21, the wise in heart will be called prudent or discerning, and sweetness of the lips increase learning. So the things communicated, the usefulness of it, and the idea that it's pleasant to the hearing, because it's not judgmental. It's actually meant to build up, to work through the person's life. Wise in heart is called to be, will be called discerning or prudent. And then verse 22, understanding is a wellspring of life to him who has it, but the correction of fools is folly. It just leads to more foolishness. So what is communicated is really ultimately the matter here. And again, there's something that anybody can communicate that's either godly or it's not. And we have that very interesting contrast, very simple to understand. Understanding is a wellspring. It's like water that comes up out of the ground for a person who is in need of drinking or something like that, because water, they're parched, if you will. Understanding, godly understanding, wisdom, counsel, instruction, any of those words that we've heard used repeatedly, to the person hearing it when it's godly, it's like water that needs, to quench thirst. It's a wellspring of life to him who has it. But the correction or the words or the counsel of a foolish person is going to lead to more folly, more foolishness, more sin, more destruction. Verse 23, the heart of the wise teaches his mouth. So the heart is going to, if a person is wise, the things going on in their heart, it's going to dictate what they say. And I repeat this often, and it just tells us how often Solomon's on the same page with what Jesus says that speaks about out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. Same principle here. It's whatever's going on in the heart is going to ultimately come out in word. So the heart of the wise teaches his mouth and adds learning with his lips. So whatever goes on in the heart, it's going to come out in the communication of things. Pleasant words are like a honeycomb, sweetness of the soul and health to the bones, going along with verse 23. They just have that that effect on people, and it's a thing of healthiness rather than of negativity and breaking down. So, verse 25, there is a way that seems right to a man, but its end of it is death. And he said it a few different ways already in Proverbs, and we'll hear it more. This is just axiomatic. It's so it's so easy for us to understand. It's so straightforward. There is a way we might think that we've got it all figured out. And the end of that, where it ends up leading, could very well just be, ruin, destruction. So we probably watched it in our own lives. And of course, this would get you to the place where it'd say, how do I avoid that? Seek godly counsel. Seek God's word. Know for sure whether or not in our world today, whether or not we're being led by the Holy Spirit. If this is Solomon, his point would be if there was a reply back to this, well, how do I avoid that? Well, make your plans all you want to. We've already read that even in this chapter. But allow God to be the one who governs. Let him look at your plans. He already knows what they are. But as it were, let him look at your plans and let him give you some direction, because maybe there's things that he's seeing that you wouldn't see. We always know that would be the case. But if we're reasoning through it. So, verse 26, the person who labors for himself, for his hungry mouth drives him on. Obviously, so the idea of need coming about what you have need of, then you look to provide. You're going to be involved in it. So a person will labor for that reason. Verse 27, an ungodly man digs up. He searches for it. He pursues after it. Pursues after and digs up evil, and it is on his lips like a burning fire. So he devises, looks for it, digs it all up, and at the end of it, as he uses what he's dug up, it has that intention of just consuming everything. It's like fire. It's meant to destroy and to consume. So this would be just counsel. If you see those people, you'll recognize them. You see the things that always comes about. You have nothing to do with those kinds of people. He's just making an observation about kind of the way that man does things that he does. A perverse man sows strife, and a whisperer separates the best of friends. A whisperer would be a person that slanders, speaks behind the scenes, like nobody's paying attention. Let me say some things. It's the idea of gossiping and those types of things. And that person sows strife. Everything that they do, when you think about sowing and reaping, what are you putting out there as seeds? Well, what are you trying to get in the end of things? Well, it says here that person, what they're sowing is strife. The intent is to stir up controversy and argument between people. So we know this. The whisperers, the one who speak behind the scenes, kind of slander and whatnot, we know what the outcome of those people are. It can even get between the best of friends if it is said in a way of trying to stir up. So we see who these people are. Again, sometimes you'll even see them in the church. It's good to call them out. They're to be rebuked. They're to be corrected. And if they won't take that correction, a church should make sure that those people are removed out of the congregation. They have no business being in that congregation. Verse 29 and 30 are together. A violent man entices his neighbor and leads him in the way that is not good. He winks with his eye and devises perverse things, and he purses his lips and brings about evil. It's verse 30 that is, again, the language has led to a couple of different interpretations of it. Let's look at verse 29 first. A violent man entices his neighbor, tries to get people to come to his side, tries to get them involved. Doesn't want to be by himself. He wants to draw other people into the things that he's doing, and he leads him in a way that is not good. It's sinful. It's destructive. The end result of it, by being enticed by this violent man and increasing in his violence and being a part of it, it's going to have a destructive outcome for both of you. Now, this person that he's speaking about here, this is what he does. He winks his eye to devise perverse things, and we think of winking eyes as just like winking one. That's something that we can do from across a room at somebody, and it's to give them a clue that something's going on, or it's an acknowledgement. Now, if that's what the case is, and that's what's intended here, then that winking is kind of like giving a visual clue to these people that that you've devised a way to do the things that you're doing, the violence and whatnot, the ones that you've enticed in, that giving the wink, or the idea of just an acknowledgement, a physical outward way of acknowledgement. The other potential for this is that they close their eyes because they don't want to have to look at their own actions. They don't want to have to look you in the eye. They just kind of turn away from it, knowing what they're doing is evil, but they don't want to have it there as a witness against them. They just go forward with it. The second part of that would be he purses his lips and brings about evil. And the pursing of the lips would be, I'm going to keep silent, not going to let them know what's really going on. I'm just going to let it play out all the plans that I've made. Or the pursing of the lips could be another one of those visual cues that giving that look. It's a clue and a cue to the person. Let's do what we had planned to do. Either one would work here, and we see both of them would play out the exact same way. A lot of times things are concealed until you don't want them concealed any longer, and a visual cue is a great way of doing it. The winking of an eye or the pursing of a lip, some kind of an outward gesture. Verse 31, the silver-haired head is a crown of glory if it is found in the way of righteousness. And so I've been waiting to get to this because I've got one of these silver-haired crown things going on because I'm getting old. But the idea that age with godliness is what's being spoken of here. That's why you have the qualifier if, and righteousness is mentioned. So verse 31, if it is found in the way of righteousness. So a person that's been, has a lot of years behind them, a lot of experience, and you can tell by looking at them, they're not young people, that crown of silver, speaking of the hair, then ultimately, if it is righteous and godly, then of course it is an honor to them. Now you might have a person that's just as old as I am or older than me, and that's a person who has done nothing in any way to ever try to do anything right before God. That's not an honorable thing. It's not worn as a crown. That's just an old guy who does devious things. So the difference is what is done with their age and what have they accumulated. Verse 32, he who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than the one who takes a city. Interesting things about this. Again, that's right along the lines with James chapter 1, verses 19 and 20. Also goes a little bit about the idea of spirit and how it is that we conduct ourselves. And I think of 1 Timothy 1:7, where it talks about God hasn't for us, provided to us, a spirit that's dominated by what those things are. Fear, but rather we're not dominated by fear. He hasn't given us a spirit of fear, but rather of love. He loves us, we love him, and that love is to be shown to others, and a sound mind. There's a discipline about them. They're not just given over to all kinds of fits of anger and fearfulness and all the rest of it. There's a real temperance in that person. And again, Paul says that to Timothy because, look, I understand I'm putting you in a position where you're going to be the guy. You're left in a very powerful, very important position, and don't be afraid of that. That's God has put you in that place. So have confidence in him. It's kind of along the same lines. The one who is slow to anger is better than the mighty. So the mighty, they may have all of their might, but if they're thrown into fits of anger, it can destroy them. But the person that's contrasted, the person that's slow to anger, they're much more deliberative. They're not going to fall into the error and the folly of rage. And he who rules his spirit than the one who takes a city. So can you have about yourself a confidence and a quietness rather than the people that can go out and may be able to physically do an awful lot of things, but that same physicality, you might run into somebody who's more physical than you are. So having confidence in the outward of things rather than the inward, that's what's being spoken of here. Have a real calmness of heart and mind and a deliberation, knowing what you're doing rather than just going out, even if you're physically capable of the picture that he's illustrating here, doesn't always win. So then the last part of this, the lot is cast into the lap, but every decision is from the Lord. And again, in the nation, the idea of trying to determine what God would do, it goes all the way back to the Urim and the Thummim of the high priest, where there was those, inside the breastplate, there was the stones, and it was a way of finding out what God would have them to do. And God did not avoid that, though we found that there were lots of perversions of it, of trying to determine what God would want done. But if this is done in a way that's acceptable as far as God is concerned, these people might be able to cast their lots, but they could start to maybe have confidence in what the outcome would be if a person's chosen for this or that. And they might start to look at this casting of the lots and determining which way to go in this. It's a reminder by Solomon here, if you're doing that and trying to find out what God's desire is, and you get that answer, just remember it's still ultimately God who answered. It has nothing to do with you. Have confidence in him, have confidence in his answer, and don't look beyond any of that. So really, really cool stuff. And again, so incredibly practical. As we close today, I want to take a look at something that really is, it's talked about quite often. Turn with me to 1 Samuel chapter 12, and I'll have you go back and look at it in your own time. You can see the things that are written in a couple of different places. I'm just going to quote from what we get in Romans, because it's one that we're all pretty much familiar with, or I would think. You can go ahead and look at Romans if you'd like, but where we're going to be today is back in the book of 1 Samuel. So the thought goes like this, and if we get somebody like depending on how you looked at it, I for one was very critical of our last administration and the things that they did. I may very well be quite critical of this administration. It's only a weekend. We'll see. But there were many things that our last president and his administration did that I absolutely could not even begin to agree upon. And then I would see sometimes people would say, well, we may not like it, but God's the one who appoints the leaders, as though there's nothing other than God just picks and chooses who he's putting in, and that's the end of it, for reasons that we don't really fully understand. Now, there is that view. There are also the other view that it's really not as much that God appoints them, but they're the people that, we hear this all the time, they're put in place because of the New World Order, and we really don't have any kind of a vote. We don't have any kind of a voice in the whole thing. And to me, that's almost a little bit on the absurd side, because if that was the case, why would you have our current president, 45, in 2016, replaced with Biden in 2020 and come back to Trump? That's bizarre. That doesn't make any sense, because they're completely working against one another. So how that works out in the minds of the people that are conspiracy theorists, I don't get. I also have a little bit of a tough time wrapping my mind around the idea that God appoints and that's the end of it. So when we read in Romans chapter 13 that we're to be subject to the governing authorities over us, because there's really only one ultimate authority, and the ones that are there in the temporal sense are put there by God. Now, again, remember, he's writing to the church there, the Roman church, so it's in the pagan part of the world. It's not as though it's a king in a godly sense. So the appointment of that is really what some people kind of disagree on. Is it that God puts him in because that's what he wants? Or does he allow the person to be put in place because that's what the people have chosen to live under that, and they don't rise up and do anything about it? I personally am more of that opinion, that God holds man responsible for his decisions. And I've used often the example of Solomon, sorry, we're stuck in Proverbs, of King Saul, the very first king that they ever had. And I would refer you back to when, as we see here in Samuel in chapter 8, starting at chapter 8 in Samuel, they were told, you're not going to like the king. Here's all the stuff that he's going to do. And it gives the impression, if you read it, you can read through it where you could go, yeah, they're the ones who demanded a king, but it seems like it's God who picked Saul. And yet we do know that he certainly we know that he really did pick David. And David is the complete contrast to Saul. Really kind of the most obvious way is just them in stature. Because when it was Saul, he looked the part. Head and shoulders above everybody else, he looked the part. David, by the time that Samuel has seen all of the different sons of Jesse, he says to him, well, none of these are the guy. Jesse, don't you have any other sons? Well, yeah, we got the one out there watching the sheep. He's kind of the runt of the litter. You sure you want to see him? And so David's brought in, and that's the man. So we know that as far as his stature, they tried to put Saul's armor on him when he went up against Goliath. And it's like, I can't even move in this stuff. It's huge. So the idea that they're completely different in stature is the most obvious of distinctions between them. But look at how they interacted with God even in their failures, and you can see they're such different men. We know that David is the one who's referred to as the man after God's own heart. Saul was never that man. But it does give the impression, because you would see God sent Samuel, go anoint this. He's going to be the king of Israel. It gives the impression that God's making the decision. But the question would be, is he the decision because the people had decided on that as well? And they had first of all demanded a king, and then Saul is presented to them. But look at what we read here. It's fascinating. Look in 1 Samuel in chapter 12, and then look at verse 12. Now, when you saw that Nahash, the king of the Amorites, came against you, and you said to me, "No, but the king shall, a king will rule over us," when the Lord your God was supposed to be your king. He's being rebuked. It says, "Now therefore, this is the king whom you have chosen, and whom you have desired." Notice he puts those as two separate things. You chose him and you desired a king, first of all, and then you picked that guy. Now you're having to deal with the consequences of it. And you said, "The Lord has set," take note, "the Lord has set a king over you." He has set it in the way of like thinking appointment, what you might see there in Romans. But notice it all begins on a couple of things that took place which God advised them against. He advised against a king, and he advised against Saul because of what the things that he would do. So here, when it comes to a matter of accountability, we find all things present. Is God the one who appoints him? And he puts him in place? Yes. Did he have him anointed? Yes. Would he have done it by his choosing? Absolutely not. Why? He doesn't want them to have a king. Why? They would look to the king to be their governor rather than him. They were to be a theocracy. Yet they wanted to be a monarchy like the other nations around them. God said, "Their rejection is not of you, Samuel. Their rejection is of me," chapter 8 of 1 Samuel. Now here, when they're being held accountable, yeah, they've got a king. God recognizes him as king. God has had him anointed as king. But ultimately here, you wanted him, and this is the man of your choosing. You got him. So when it comes to that question about our presidents that we might have in our own country, which is it? Did God put him in place? Or has God just given us what our will was? And in our case, in this country, we have a voice in this, and the people had spoken in these elections. I'm not one of the conspiracy theorists who think that somehow the New World Order is running the world from some smoke-filled room somewhere in the world. Because if that was the case, they wouldn't have put Trump back in. Why would you want that guy back in place? Look at the things he's doing just in his first week. You could make the case with the previous administration because nobody knew what was going on there. All you could see what was being done, and it was an abomination. So I'm of that opinion that, yeah, God's going to hold you responsible for your decision, but in some places in the world, for sure ours, and for sure it was this way in the Old Testament, the people spoke. And God said, "You've spoken. I'm not going to insist that you do it my way, but you're going to have to deal with the consequences, and good or bad." So just an interesting discussion that comes up. But Saul is a great example. And the selection of Saul starts at 1 Samuel 8. Read it for yourself, and you'll see even the beginning part of his kingship, some things he did really, really well. God wanted to say, "Look, this is not my first choice, but I'd like to bless it if the people will allow it." And we can see how it all worked out. Saul was everything that he said and more, and just not really a good guy. It was followed by David, who was a much different person with all of his faults. He was definitely somebody who was very sensitive to the things of the Lord. So the people still have a voice in these things. Unfortunately, a lot of times from the direction of the king can come some really horrible things if that person is wicked and evil. And we've seen that through the history of mankind. So wanted to address that. If you have any questions on anything, if you have some suggestions, things you'd like to hear me address, please let me know. Contact me through the ministry's website, oldpaththeology.net, and we will pick up next week at Proverbs 17.